And I'm going to focus on the efforts of descendants of West Africans who were captured, sold as slaves to British sea captains, and then sold again to the Welsh plantation owners in Jamaica to develop the sugar plantations that generated unimaginable wealth for the Pennant family. That castle was built with the wealth generated from the 5 plantations that the Pennant family had in Jamaica. It's really quite shocking, and it's really quite obscene, because it wasn't a necessary building. It was just built to show off the wealth that the family had generated. And it was built at the time after the family members were back in Wales, and the plantations were being managed by overseers and agents. It's now owned by the National Trust, who don't do a very good job of telling the story, in my humble opinion. In 2007, they did an excellent exhibition, but in the years since then, it's been reduced in size, and they've tried a few ideas, but we've got ideas that we'd like to share with them, and things that we might be able to do. Now, when the Pennants Heritage Research Group, so the word Pennants, I'm using it in 2 contexts. One is it's the name of the family. They're actually called the Douglas Pennant family now. And the other is the name of the community. It's called Pennants. So when the Pennants Heritage Research Group, we've been undertaking research into shared history of the descendants of enslaved people in that community. The reason that we linked with that community is because of the name. And we found a very interesting story. It seems that the strike action of local rural workers, which is the theme of this presentation, in the community of Pennants, caused the sale of the plantations in Jamaica, because they were still owned by the family in 1938. 100 years after emancipation. So it takes a bit of getting your head around all of this, and what how important this action of the tenants, the workers on in the area, who were beholden still to this family up till 1938. And then the estates were divided up for local use. In many ways, that didn't help because you had to be able to buy a plot after the plantation was sold. So it was only people who could afford to buy a plot that benefited, and others were no doubt still struggling, which is why the issues of poverty are a theme that will go through the talk that I'm giving. So clearly, it's no coincidence that the successful strike and campaigns by local workers in Pennants happened at the same time when the labour strikes were sweeping across the Caribbean. Now, if you don't know much about the labour strikes that swept across the Caribbean, then I definitely recommend you do a bit of research on that, because the whole story of Jamaica politically is based on that. Has its origins at this time. But in focusing on this one small significant story of labour resistance, will showcase the reality and impact of the hundreds of years of imperial domination that created much of the wealth still in evidence in Britain today. So just to let you know that the Pennant family, Gifford Pennant, I'll be telling you in a moment, was part of Cromwell's forces, and he was part of the invasion force in 1656, I think it was. Okay, anyway, this may spark an interest with local links between the wealth generated by workers of the Black Country and landed gentry in the many countries around the world where the goods that were produced were used. So one of the themes I'm working on as well is commodities And it's just makes you shudder when you read through some of the lists of things that were required by the plantation owners or the Africans who were trading. And I'm not sure how well. I think last year you had a really good speaker about Black country, Black history. Anyway, this is our Pennants project. So 10 years of efforts have been made to develop these links. Told you about Gifford Pennant. He never returned to Wales, neither did his son or his grandson, but took a lead in developing plantations. And you might have heard of Sir Henry Morgan. He was a Welshman, fellow Welshman and pirate, and he had plantations north of Clarendon. This is one of the Pennant family's other plantations, which is in Denbigh. And there's Richard Douglas Pennant, the little guy, and Yasser Safari in 2008. And we actually got them performing together in an attempt to build a bridge so that we could begin discussions about reparation, which we have continued our efforts, and presently we will be seeing some success. So this is back to the research team again, which is also supported by Coy Roach, myself, Vivian Crawford. We're very fortunate because he's the retired executive director of the Institute of Jamaica. So he's really knowledgeable about history. And so Dr. Walter Lavelle, who's part of the Rotary Club in Maypen, who's very keen on school links. So how did we start our research? Well, I was in Jamaica a while back, and a lovely lady called Miss Robin trusted me with a document written in the 1970s about the local history of Pennants and the story of the Poor Man's Improvement and Land Settlement Association. So, special respect to Miss Rob, who passed away recently. This is a timeline just to get your head round it, because the Pennant family were there at the beginning of English development on Jamaica, and or British development, I should say, and they were there until 1940. So it's a long time. So first of all, we've got the point about the British invading Jamaica and defeating the Spanish. Exactly how then the British split up the island and got people developing plantations, and there's so much more that you could find out about, and why they felt that bringing Africans to the island would benefit them. They could obviously see it once the trade really got going, but how did it start? Then I've moved 1807, the abolition of the Slave Trade Act, because that didn't actually affect what was going on the island, except it was harder to get new enslaved workers. Then in 1834, Emancipation, the plantation owners received compensation, but the freed slaves were given nothing, but with a 6-year apprenticeship scheme introduced. So life was even worse for them after emancipation in many ways. But the apprenticeship scheme was finally abandoned after a few years, and slavery was abolished by 1838. 100 years later, 1938, the tenants of Lord Penrhyn went on strike and won. Now, that 100-year gap is significant because the tenants believed that Queen Victoria had promised that 100 years after emancipation, they would be given land. And when they discovered that was not so, that was just the last straw. So the freed slaves were given nothing. They lost any support they'd been given by their owners. had no right to any housing. They had no right to any land to grow provisions. They got no right to medical care. There were so many things that it might not have looked as if they were supported well by their owners, but there were certain things, and any land that was good land would have been owned by another plantation owner, so you couldn't just go and build your house somewhere else. So the clear iniquities of the apprenticeship scheme that followed the apparent abolition of slavery in the British colonies, and things became much more dreadful. I just look at my grammar here and thinking, yes. Apprentices across the Caribbean refused to work, often provoking severe retaliation and imprisonment. Okay, whiz on. So there's lots of interesting information out there to read up more about this. But this is a particularly interesting story because this was written by an apprenticed labourer in Jamaica. So the apprenticeship scheme left them formerly enslaved, suffering the worst of both worlds. They were still tied to their former owners and required to work for them, and they'd lost what minimum legal protection they'd previously had. This is clearly interested in the testimony of James Williams. My maiden name was Williams. There's lots of Williamses and Jones and Hugheses, as well as lots of people in Jamaica with Scottish surnames or English surnames. Anyway, James Williams was formerly enslaved at Penshurst in the parish of St Anne. He was about 18 and he gave his testimony in 1837, and his resilient character shines through it. When it was first published in Great Britain, it caused an outcry and helped in the final abolition of slavery in all its forms throughout the British colonies. Just have to look at those maps and see all those countries coloured in pink. In case you should doubt his account, it was backed up by a testimony recorded by a formal commission of inquiry. So that's something that you could follow up on. But you don't have to go to books. You don't have to go to academic libraries. You can go to Pinterest and find all kinds of interesting things on it, we discovered. Because if it wasn't for Pinterest, we wouldn't have known about this. Because on the 23rd of April, 1938 in Jamaica, Robert Rumble's Poor Man's Improvement and Land Settlement Association sent a petition to the governor demanding a minimum wage for agricultural workers and peasants and an end to the exploitation by landlords, stating that a century after their forebears were released from slavery, they were still in a state of economic slavery to the landowners. Rent strikes and land occupations began, and the tenants seized lands and erected fences around them. And how do we know this? Told you already, Pinterest or Instagram. What was significant about this was that I found it earlier in the year and did a little bit of maths and worked out it was 85 years. So we had a big celebration of 85 years of the date that the Poor Man's Improvement and Land Settlement Association sent a petition to the governor. So that was really good. So there's the evidence there on Instagram. And here's Robert Rumble. This is the only picture we could find of him. But there are people alive today who remember him and talk about him and reminisce. And when he passed, so significant a person was he that the Prime Minister of Jamaica then in 1972 was helicoptered in for the funeral, and there are children who remember the helicopter coming in to the football field and his tomb's there, and we're looking at helping the community refurbish the area. I did a bit more Googling, and I mean, what you can find is just magnificent these days, isn't it? Anyway, discovered that Professor Anthony Bogues from Brown University had written an article in the Jamaican Gleaner, and he referred to Robert Rumble. So remember, we're doing this research on Zoom when COVID's on, so we can't get into any proper archives or anything. So in 1919, there were attempts to form trade unions, and there were also efforts within the emergent middle class, like Ken Hill's National Reform Association. In Upper Clarendon, Robert Rumble formed the Poor Man's Land Association. That was the name it went on to be called, advocating land for small farmers. Then in 1930, the Rastafari movement emerged, and Jamaica in the 1930s, before the 1938 general strike, was a political and social cauldron. Out of this cauldron, the PNP was formed as a national movement and political party. That's the People's National Party. And there was a link to something there. So I contacted Professor Anthony Bogues at Brown University, and his response was amazing, because not only is he leads in the Slavery and Justice Centre at Brown University, which is near New York, but he also happened to be working for a newspaper as a young man, and he interviewed Robert Rumble. He feels this is an essential area for further study, but we've just got to wait for a time when Professor Bogues has got the opportunity to try and find his notes, perhaps, or at least think through some of the things that Robert Rumble told him. So that was amazing. So he's been really supportive and gave us a talk. And then I discovered this on the internet as well, which was a Labour Day message from the Prime Minister, Portia Simpson Miller, who's a wonderful, wonderful person. So she said in 2013 that she thinks of Robert Rumble as the small farmer who'd returned from Cuba and who in 1937 formed the organisation called the Poor Man's Improvement and Land Settlement Association. And in March 1938, the association boasted a membership of 800. And on April the 23rd, he addressed a petition to the governor as follows. Because we haven't even been able to get hold of a copy of the petition yet, but we'll get there. We are the sons of slaves who have been paying rent to landlords for fully many decades. We want better wages. We've been exploited for years. We want a minimum wage. We want freedom in this 100th year of our emancipation. We are still economic slaves. So Rumble agitated for the peasants and got better wages for agricultural workers. This strike was very successful. We're talking here about March 1938. By 1940, the Pennant family had sold their plantations. So that's really significant, and we know a little bit about the sales. So one of the people who supported Robert Rumble was Richard Hart, and he wrote in his book on Labour rebellions that by the end of June 1938, calm had returned after the island-wide protests. So other protests were mainly in towns and ports, but this appears to be the only agricultural protest that happened. So she says a number of factors had contributed to this. Perhaps most important have been launching by Bustamante of a trade union and assurances from him and the much respected barrister Norman Manley that the workers would receive proper representation. Then there was an announcement that on June the 14th, a royal commission would arrive shortly to investigate the conditions that had undoubtedly created the expectations that improvements would be coming. And by June the 28th, Acting Governor Woolley had announced that 2 loans would be raised to finance land settlements and other infrastructural developments. So we're trying hard to find out the detail of all of this and how it happened so quickly. And apparently there's an organisation called the Henry George Foundation that worked on behalf of the the tenants to facilitate the sale of the plantations and to then make it possible to sell on land to locals. Notice what I said, sell on the land. The struggles of the workers had borne fruit, the injustice had to yield to human dignity, and that struggle continues today. So we must continue to be vigilant to protect hard-won rights, said Portia Simpson Miller. All right, I won't read through the whole of this, but Jamaica and the Caribbean were born in the midst of the dominance of European colonialism. We know that. And this dominance was nurtured in the racial slavery of the plantation systems, and one in which there was anti-Black racism and exploitation of the ordinary Jamaican. So, as you can see, it was really a very, very significant time in Jamaican history. However, the frustrations and desperations of the tenants with plots of land on Lord Penryn's plantations boiled over, and the organisation was set up, they had membership, and Robert Rummel was their leader. So, in fact, this tenancy system was a flagrant denial against residents' rights, aggravated by the thoughtless way in which it was administered by the attorney and his assistant and the overseers. This led to deep resentment on the setting out of two alternatives. Either to pay the outstanding rent, so if people were behind with their rent, tenants were behind with their rent within 6 months, or prepare to reap his crops and leave the holding within 6 months with no strings attached. But if a particular tenant failed to accept either of the options, he was simply turned off, and any improvements he'd made to the land to it were robbed, or rather levied, presumably to pay his arrears. So it's really concerning that these are Lord Penryn's attorney, his assistant, and the overseer, who were obviously behaving very badly towards the people who were renting land off them in Jamaica. They were also behaving dreadfully to the quarrymen in their quarries in North Wales. And I'll tell you a little bit about that in a moment. So just to say, in the case of Mr. Shortridge, who procured a holding from the Pennant family, from Lord Penryn, and he proceeded to cultivate sugarcane. He built a boiling house in the hope of meeting his financial obligations, almost made it to the finishing line before he sold his first tin of cane juice, and he received his 6 months' notice, and it has elapsed. So his entire operation, boiling house, cane still standing in the field, liquor in the barrel and gutter too, and even his few tins of ready sugar were all acquired for the landlord under the legal terms of levying for 6 months' rent. In addition, he was also turned off the holding, presumably to join the tree dwellers. Now, we want to learn more. I mean, it's just appalling, absolutely appalling. And yet the funds that were coming into these estates were then being passed over to the family in North Wales. So in addition, we say about the tree dwellers, we want to find out more about that because that's a story. So it was really awful to see that residents had to make their homes in trees. Little wonder these conditions drove the people to extremes of temporarily forgetting petty distances and differences, crystallising their determination to provide a unified front to better their plight. Okay, so let's see what came out of consultations with local people from Pennants, Clarendon, Jamaica. Well, here's some photos taken by Clifford of the locals as he went round and asked people's advice. In the early days, you have to be really careful because Clifford was really so enthusiastic, and I was going, "You are wearing your mask, aren't you, Clifford? You are this, you know." So one of the comments was from a lovely lady that as a child she was expected to either sweep the yard with a broom weed, a broom made from a special brush, scrub found in the yard, clean the house floor with wax, straw dye, and the coconut brush. Or she might have to boil the pig feed, most vegetable scrap from peel of food for the family pot, as well as possibly going to tire out the goat or the cow or do the dishes. So it's certainly expected to support in the home. Bathing was done outside the house in the bathtub or the nearby stream or river, and generally there was no bathroom. And her favourite bathing place was a waterfall about 10 minutes from her home. So people are talking about their childhoods, and we're now linking with the Jamaica Memory Bank, who will assist us with doing, if you like, proper oral history other than sending Clifford out. And church going was another one, and coconut oil's mentioned here, and shoes or not shoes. So people were talking about that. Helping on the farm, particularly at weekends. The children would pick up the coffee or cocoa beans that spilled on the ground, and then they could sell the rat cuts, and they were able to perhaps buy a little something for themselves. Schooling was compulsory for most children, and conscientious parents would get sorted out, but some farmers wouldn't send their children to school on Fridays, instead taking them out of school to work on the farm. The Douglas Pennant Family Foundation have offered £25,000 to assist with the building of an infant department at the primary school. That's one of the things we're working on. So coming forward to today, one of the issues faced is persistent poverty. During the 1990s, poverty rate stood at 25%, and it still has a significant impact on the lives of the populace. So poverty is perhaps the most critical issue. Other issues include health issues, crime and corruption. The education system isn't perfect, but I have to say there's some amazing people who've come through the education system and developed competencies to compete with the best in the world. And but it can be challenging, because even when you graduate, finding a job's another issue. So unemployment. And I know a lot of my colleagues in Jamaica have got amazing qualifications, far better than me. So we're also, just to say, and we found that bit of information about the current issues from My Island, Jamaica, which some of you might read online. But the Pennants Heritage Research Group, we are also exploring reparatory justice for the descendants of enslaved plantation workers. So I've done that one already. This is just about the planting attorney, the people who should know better. So why is this story of the strike of special interest to people in North Wales? Well, because of the local quarrymen. They went on strike from 1900 to 1903. At the time, this was the longest strike in British history, and the memories of these awful years still resonate in the area. I think some of my family were probably quarrymen who went on strike, because some of my family went to South Wales and were never spoken of again. I mean, it's just awful, but that's what I remember, hearing about these people who didn't live in North Wales anymore. Okay, so the point on the last slide was that nothing was reinvested in Jamaica. There was no development of the places there, or the schools, or anything else. So this is just the North Wales strike, the Penrhyn Slate Quarries strike. I thought you might be interested if you didn't know about it. And a bit repetitive there. And here we are with the women went out, and men as well, singing to try and help. But this was interesting. Professor Catherine Hall is a very respected historian, and she wrote about the Pennant family and their employment practices, and looking at minimum when the quarrymen were struggling with them. The lockout went on. There was a lockout in 1896, and then refused to permit union dues to be collected, and then the second lockout, and a third of the labour force of 4,000 men were forced to go to South Wales, as I say, to the coal mines. And really, this is very much remembered in the community. So there are the mountains where the slate quarries are. There's the castle. No expense spared. Right, we meet every week to progress our reparations activities, and the aims of the project are to get a better understanding of the shared history, to identify the current needs in the area, and to find out community priorities. So we've been working on that, and to support the development of links between school students, and now there's funding from the Welsh Government to help with that, so we're looking at that. Okay, so this is our bunch. We meet on Zoom. Now we've got an open meeting of our North Wales Jamaica Society on the 4th of November. You're welcome to come along if you wanted to find out more. And on behalf of our team, thank you for giving me this opportunity to share our story and seek some form of reparatory justice for the descendants of enslaved plantation workers, and understand perhaps a bit more about